The very enterprise that somebody in the 20th century can write an epic looks incredible to most people, because generally it is believed that epics are written during the infancy of a culture. You have the Ramayana, you have the Mahabharata, you have the great Greek epics, you have epics in Latin, you have epics in all cultures, but most of them were written, were produced during the infancy of civilization, of culture. 20th century has been an age, has been a century. Life has been so much fragmentized that there is nothing whole left anymore. Anything sublime necessarily sounds bombastic. And so, the temper of the time probably demands a different kind of poetry, where epic is a kind of holistic vision of life which is now lost. And so, we have almost reached a point of no return in the senility of our civilization and culture. So at a point like this, for Sri Aurobindo to write an epic remains to many people something of a mystery. They think they can't take anyone seriously who thinks of writing epics now. Epics now, you can write haikus, you can write little poems, at best 5 pages, 10 pages. Where do people have time for 720 pages of poetry? You just forget about it. So nobody takes this enterprise seriously, and some of my colleagues at the university have such wrong notions about these things. And one of the reasons why they don't look at Savitri is the claim that Savitri is an epic. How can anybody write an epic now? Full stop. Now, very often, half-truth is very dangerous. And epic cannot be written now is a half-truth. It's a very dangerous half-truth. Now, Sri Aurobindo always has been saying that we are now on the threshold of a new age of civilization, where the old barriers are crashing down. Man is realizing this entire universe is a global village. Caste, creed, religion, race. These things have no intrinsic value to the inner life of an individual. And so, after this rationalism, individualism, we are probably going into the subjective age. A new civilization is going to come to us. A new man is being born. A new culture is coming. And therefore, just as this is a transitional period which marks the end of one cycle of civilization, it also marks the beginning of another cycle of civilization, which is the subjective civilization. A civilization in which man's interior landscape is going to mean a great deal. Man's psychological problems, his spiritual problems are going to assume a greater importance. And therefore, if you look at the present time, at the beginning of a new cycle of civilization, you will see that we are already at the infancy of a new civilization. And since we are at the infancy of a new civilization, this is the right time for an epic of a subjective kind. Now, Sri Aurobindo has written an epic. All epics basically describe a journey. Ramayana Rama's journey, Ayana, Rama's Ayana, that's what it describes. Odyssey is also a journey. All epics basically describe a journey. But these journeys until now were journeys on the outer surface of this earth. Now there is no more outer surface that remains to be explored. We have gone as far as the moon and we think of going beyond. Very soon those of you who have enough money will be able to spend your summer vacation on the moon and come back here before the schools reopen. So there is nothing there at the outer space to explore anymore. But the one space man has not yet explored, I am not talking about individuals, but I am talking humanity as a whole, as a group, as a collectivity, is the inner space of man. And there was this person called Sri Aurobindo, who devoted 50 to 60 years of his life to an exclusive pursuit of this. During these 50 years, his primary occupation was exploration of the inner regions of man. And that is why, if he cannot write an epic of this kind of an inner exploration of man, the spiritual dimension of man's life, human civilization, who else can? So it is therefore incorrect to say this is not a time for an epic, this is not a time for the old kind of epic, this is the right time for a new kind of epic. And Savitri represents this new kind of epic. As you will see, as I pointed out earlier on, out of the 49 cantos that we have here, 29 are directly devoted to the inner exploration of yoga, Ashwapati's yoga and Savitri's yoga. 29 out of 49, about 13 to 14,000 lines out of a total of 24,000 lines. And therefore, I must say that this is the right time for an epic of this kind. Now, since the subjective age is coming, Sri Aurobindo was thinking of the social structure for the subjective age. He was thinking of various aspects, so he wrote Human Cycle, Ideal of Human Unity. He also looked at poetry, mainly English poetry, in some detail, and saw the evolutionary trend even within English poetry, beginning with Beowulf, Chaucer, Shakespeare, 17th century, 18th century, the Romantics, Tennyson, Swinburne, then Meredith, 20th century, some of these 20th century writers. He was not producing a textbook history of English literature, that was not the purpose. He was giving a perspective on English literature which will enable you to see it as an expression of this evolution of consciousness. English literature also represents this evolution of consciousness. And he was trying to say, now, no matter whether you're English or American or German or Indian, whoever you are, the primary thrust a poet will develop will be a thrust inwards. And spiritual poetry will be a new kind of poetry. And that poetry will have a prominent place in the coming age. What the trends of that poetry will be, what will be the marks of excellence of that poetry will be, these are things he discussed in some detail in his book called The Future Poetry. Now, he describes poetry as the mantra of the real. Poetry essentially is a mantra. And how does he describe a mantra? The mantra, poetic expression of the deepest spiritual reality. Mantra is the poetic expression of the deepest spiritual reality. Is only possible when three highest intensities of poetic speech meet and become indissolubly one. Three highest intensities have to meet and become one. What are these three highest intensities? One, a highest intensity of rhythmic movement. a highest intensity of rhythmic movement. 2, a highest intensity of verbal form and thought substance. So, sound value, thought value. And a highest intensity of the soul's vision of truth. Soul value. When these three values come together and fuse, the highest musical sound value, with it comes the vibration, with it comes the rhythm, and the highest thought value, thought substance, emotional substance, plus what he calls the highest intensity of the soul's vision of truth. In some other place he says, poetry is born in the heights of the superconscient, but it finds its reflection in man's what is called the Hridaya Samudra, in the innermost sanctum of the human consciousness. It gets reflected. So, a birth of a mantra has a kind of twin origin. It is born there in the highest supraconscient level, and simultaneously it is projected in the heart of the poet. All great poetry comes about by a unison of these three elements. It is the insufficiency of one or another which makes the inequalities in the work of even the greatest poets. So you need sound value, thought value, and as he calls, soul's vision of truth. When does then poetry become a mantra? But it is only at a certain highest level of the fused intensities, a highest level of the fused intensities of these three values, the mantra becomes possible. Mantra becomes possible when the highest value of these three intensities fuse together. Now, our purpose here is not to get into the aesthetics of this mantra, but there is a certain kind of poetry which Aurobindo described as future poetry, which humanity will be producing more and more people will be taking interest in this kind of poetry. The notion of mantra is not alien to the Indian tradition. We all have Vedic mantras. Vedas were a time when mantras came out in symbolic form. Mantras very often look as if they are describing external rituals. They are describing homa and yajna and so on. They are only in external form. But in fact, they have an interior meaning. They have a spiritual content. So that kind of poetry was produced in the Vedic times, which was a symbolic time. Now we have gone beyond the rational age. This poetry, the mantric poetry that is now going to be produced, will not be exactly like the Vedic poetry, but it will have the same soul values, as it were. The various mantras, if you really look at a mantra, take for example Gayatri. According to the Indian tradition, Gayatri is one of the highest mantras, the most potent mantras. But we all have been given Gayatri Upadesh. As they say, the Upadesh is given in the left ear and it goes out of the right ear. Some of us, probably out of respect for our teachers, for our parents, pretend or go through this process maybe for a few months and then forget about it. But there is this faith in the Indian tradition that a mantra, if properly cultivated, can be very potent. Now, what is it? I mean, people have talked about it. How do you cultivate mantra? How do you derive great benefit from poetry like this? Let's say Savitri is mantric poetry. How do you respond to it? How do you read it? How do you open yourself to it? Well, in Sri Aurobindo's bounty is such that he has given you guidance at every stage, and he has a beautiful description how a mantra is to be received and how it works in the proper receptacle. This is on page 375, about 10 lines from the top. The context is not absolutely essential for understanding this passage, so I leave out the context. As when the mantra sinks in yoga's ear, its message enters, stirring the blind brain. He says, when you first hear, listen to a mantra, naturally being a mental being, you would try to understand it in intellectual terms. Your first approach is through the mind. Its message enters, stirring the blind brain. It creates some kind of a stir at the intellectual level and keeps in the dim, ignorant cells its sound. But every mantra has a sound body. You can't leave out the sound body and take only the meaning of a mantra. Has no meaning. Mantra is itself its meaning. The entire thing comes with this body. So when we receive it, we try to receive the physical sound, the sound body of it at one level, and the meaning of it we try to analyze. Now, as you know, many of us have probably chanted Gayatri, and the meaning of the Gayatri itself is very straightforward, very simple, and you wonder what is the great potency in this Gayatri mantra, because intellectually all that it asks is for illumination, the highest light, let that illuminate your intellect. That's what you are basically saying. Whether you say it in English or whether you say it in Sanskrit, does it matter? Isn't it what the mantra says? It is not what the mantra says. What the mantra says, your outer ear cannot hear, the outer mind cannot hear. Before you can say what the mantra says, as the poet himself will explain in a minute, the outer mind, the outer consciousness has to settle down to what is called a receptive, hushed silence. He says, the hearer understands a form of words, and musing on the index thought it holds, he strives to read it with the laboring mind. You look at the etymological meaning of this word and that word. You read commentaries of this and commentaries on that. There are big fat books on each one of these mantras. You read all those and become a pandit. You know the meaning of everything. And yet, you haven't really understood the potency of the mantra. You haven't understood the power of the mantra. You haven't yet felt it. He strives to read it with the laboring mind, but finds bright hints, not the embodied truth. You have not yet been able to get into touch with the truth that the mantra embodies. Then comes the stage when you are ready to receive the mantra. You see, even what you call receive the mantra, this is very basic. I guess more and more modern education is making us anti-mantra. Take, for example, I am sitting here, I am talking to you. Now, even before I can mean something to you, you have to receive what I say and not keep interpreting what I say. You see, there used to be a friend of mine, I don't name the context. After each one of my talks, he would confront me and summarize my talk in his words. Is this what you said? Once or twice, I was quite confounded because I didn't say any of those things. This is what he heard because he was not listening to me. You see, in modern age, we are supposed to ask questions. After every speech, you must ask questions. Unless you ask questions, you are dumb. You must ask searching questions, pointing questions. Fine. But before you ask searching and pointing questions, you have the obligation to try and understand what the chap is saying. So receptivity, to be a good listener, itself is a difficult art. Otherwise, you go and listen to any number of Swamijis. You go home with your old particular slogan that we have prepared. This is what he said, right? Okay, so you have touched your base, you are happy, Swamiji is happy, everybody is happy. You are not listening to what he is saying. You are listening to yourself. The same thing is happening even in the case of mantra. You are not listening to it. Now, to be able to listen to this mantra, the first thing is to be able to cultivate this silence. That's why he says, then falling silent in himself to know, he meets the deeper listening of his soul. The deeper listening of his soul. See, once you are given to the chanting of this mantra, after a while your physical mind doesn't have to pick it up. It keeps repeating itself from within. And gradually, if you really are poised in the right mood of receptivity, he meets the deeper listening of his soul. The word repeats itself in rhythmic strains. The word repeats itself in rhythmic strain. You don't have to repeat it. The word itself has caught hold of your being. Then, once that stage comes, thought, vision, feeling, sense. Thought, vision, feeling, sense. The body's self are seized unutterably, and he endures an ecstasy and an immortal change. Every mantra is supposed to bring great potencies to your consciousness and change it. It's not a mechanical activity. You just go on saying, oh, I have said 1 crore Ramanam Japa, you keep a diary, dictionary, all these things probably if they help somebody. I'm not criticizing them, but that's not the primary thing. The primary thing is this ability to open yourself up in absolute mood of surrender, silence, receive it, let it work within yourself such that thought, vision, feeling, sense, the body's self are seized unutterably, and he endures an ecstasy and an immortal change. Then what happens? He feels a wideness and becomes a power. All knowledge rushes on him like a sea. All knowledge rushes on him like a sea. Transmuted by the white spiritual ray, he walks naked in naked heavens of joy and calm, sees the God face and hears transcendent speech. Every mantra is the outer body of a transcendent world, and you hear the bija of it, the seed, this transcendent word. An equal greatness in her life was sown. It refers to Savitri. This is what happened to Savitri when she received, as the context shows, Ashwapati's words like a mantra. Now, this is what the mantra, how it works, and you have to qualify yourself to be a practitioner of a mantra in this way. Now, Sri Aurobindo has talked about a great deal about overhead aesthesis, the higher levels of the mind, their characteristics and so on. A great detailed description of it is given in some chapters of the Life Divine. In Savitri itself, there are passages where he talks about these. If you are interested, page 659, about 12 lines from the bottom. On summit mind are radiant altitudes, exposed to the luster of infinity, outskirts and dependencies of the house of truth, upraised estates of mind and measureless. There man can visit, but there he cannot live. Says right now, there are levels of consciousness above the mind which are not native to man yet. Man can visit them by an effort of his consciousness, but he can't live there at the moment. And this is a description, this page and the next one, of cosmic thought, of illumined mind, of intuition, overmind, supermind, and so on. So those who are interested can look up these 3 or 4 pages. I won't go into it. What I want to do with the remaining time that we have is read a couple of samples where Sri Aurobindo himself has recognized his own writing in Savitri as coming from the highest level of inspiration. The best thing is to get your ears tuned, listen to it carefully, and see what great poetry sounds like. And the examples I'm going to read, one of them I had already read yesterday, if you remember, during the very first talk. I'll read just a part of it. It comes on page 14. This is the description of Savitri we talked about yesterday. I'll just read a little bit of it, beginning with the last line on page 14. Ardent was her self-poised, unstumbling will, her mind a sea of white sincerity, passionate in flow, had not one turbid wave. As in a mystic and dynamic dance, a priestess of immaculate ecstasies, inspired and ruled from truth's revealing vault, moves in some prophet cavern of the gods, a heart of silence in the hands of joy, inhabited with rich creative beats, a body like a parable of dawn that seemed a niche for veiled divinity or golden temple door to things beyond. That entire passage, Sri Aurobindo has acknowledged, shows a stamp of the inspiration coming from very high sources. Another very interesting passage I would like to draw your attention to, which is on page 343. Here again, not much need be said about the context, except to say that this is Ashwapati now talking to the Divine Mother and saying that he is already seen in the occult world a new race being ready, made ready to come down and occupy the earth. You know, the story goes, as you know, when the Divine Mother sees Ashwapati, she is very happy to see him, and she says, whatever you have gained is yours. Don't ask that I give all this to mankind right away. Man has to wait. He is so much in love with ignorance. He loves his present position so much that he has no value for all this. Let him wait. In the course of evolution, he will also come and see this great effulgent perfection that you have seen. Let man wait. Ashwapati is unwilling to go back empty-handed. He pleads on behalf of mankind. And one of the things he says, why should we delay? Because I've already seen the new race is ready in the occult world. It's all there. It just has to be precipitated. Why don't you give this push? That's what Ashwapati is saying. And they're describing this new race, and these are very wonderful words of great poetic power and beauty. Page 343, about 9-10 lines from the bottom. I saw the omnipotent's flaming pioneers over the heavenly verge which turns towards life, come crowding down the amber stairs of birth, forerunners of a divine multitude. Out of the paths of the morning star they came, into the little room of mortal life. I saw them cross the twilight of an age, the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn, the great creators with wide brows of calm, the massive barrier breakers of the world, and wrestlers with destiny in her lists of will, the laborers in the quarries of the gods, the messengers of the incommunicable, the architects of immortality. Into the fallen human sphere they came, faces that wore the immortal's glory still, voices that communed still with the thoughts of God, bodies made beautiful by the Spirit's light, carrying the magic word, the mystic fire, carrying the Dionysian cup of joy, approaching eyes of a diviner man, lips chanting an unknown anthem of the soul, feet echoing in the corridors of time, high priests of wisdom, sweetness, might and bliss, discoverers of beauty's sunlit ways, and swimmers of love's laughing fiery floods, and dancers within rapture's golden doors, their tread one day shall change the suffering earth and justify the light on nature's face. Sublimity in poetry is one thing, as I said, modern man distrusts the most. Now, unless you are Sri Aurobindo, you shouldn't try to write this kind of poetry. Only a person who has that kind of a vision can write this kind of poetry and ring true. In the hands of any other poet, this is an impossible feat to achieve. So when modern readers doubt sublimity and very often mistake it for bombast, I don't blame them. But they haven't yet met the like of Sri Aurobindo. And that is why it is wrong to apply the same standards to any other poet which you apply to Sri Aurobindo. Here is an entirely different kind of a poet. His vision was different, his level of consciousness was different, and therefore this is a kind of sublime poetry he can produce, and it sounds very genuine. It's only by opening yourself to poetry of this kind that you yourself, that was Sri Aurobindo's hope, that in this transcendence of mental limitations, in man's upward ascent, poetry of this kind probably will be a great help. And that was why he was hoping that more and more people will cultivate poetry of this kind. Now, we have one thing that we still have to do. In fact, I meant to do it on the very first day, and that is bring to your attention certain things which the mother has said about Savitri. If you don't refer to these things, I don't think any introductory talks on Savitri would ever be regarded as complete. Many of you probably are aware of this, but as you know, we are making these tapes not just for you, but people who are not here. And so, I will read out some of the things that the mother has said about Savitri, what in her view is the importance of Savitri, and how one should receive Savitri. Well, as we all know, we have said that there has to be a concentrated, receptive silence in which Savitri should be read. Savitri is not a book to be seen, it's a book to be read. And in a kind of subdued voice, you have to read it to yourself, not to other people, but to yourself. It helps to read it to oneself, because the poetry has to have this sound body. And then, as I see it, my own way of going about Savitri is, there are many, many passages of Savitri you don't understand. Don't feel discouraged by what you don't understand. Concentrate on passages you do understand. And no matter who you are, if you have a wide enough acquaintance with Savitri, you will find at least half a dozen passages which which are already making sense to you. If they do, go back to those passages again and again and again. Once you do it, you will find a surprising thing happening. You have a dark background against which there are dots of light, as it were. A few, 6 or 8 or 10. Everything else is black, you don't understand it. Gradually, as you begin to read this, your acquaintance grows with this passage, the dot gradually expands. And you will find that the lines preceding the lines that you understand, but which you didn't understand earlier on, and the lines following the passage that you understand begin to make sense to you. So you will find on all sides this light circles expanding and expanding until the whole screen is well lit. This is the way to do it. As I said, Sri Aurobindo waited for Savitri to descend en masse, as it were, from some other level. And you shouldn't try to say, I will read Savitri during weekend. We have some good time, Saturday, Sunday, good time, so I will read Savitri. It is not for weekend reading. It is something you cultivate, you devote your life to. We have the old Indian tradition of Parayan. You go back to it again and again, but it should not be a ritual, it should not be mechanical. Your heart's adoration, heart's love, feeling should all be there. And once you do it, little by little, you will find Savitri takes you up and makes you understand. And this is what the mother says in this book. She says, Savitri alone is sufficient to make you climb to the highest peaks. If truly one knows how to meditate on Savitri, one will receive all the help one needs. For him who wishes to follow this path, it's a concrete help, as though the Lord himself were taking you by the hand and leading you to the destined goal. And then every question, however personal it may be, has its answer here. Every difficulty finds solution herein. Indeed, there is everything that is necessary for doing the yoga. She again says, it may be said then that Savitri is a revelation. It's a meditation. It's a quest of the infinite, the eternal. If it is read with this aspiration for immortality, the reading itself will serve as a guide to immortality. To read Savitri is indeed to practice yoga, spiritual concentration. One can find there all that is needed to realize the divine. Each verse of Savitri is like a revealed mantra which surpasses all that man possessed by way of knowledge. And I repeat this, that the words are arranged in such a way that the sonority of the rhythm leads you to the origin of sound, which is Om. Everything is there. Mysticism, occultism, philosophy, the history of evolution, the history of man, of the gods, of creation, of nature. how the universe was created and why, for what purpose, what destiny, all is here. Indeed, Savitri is something concrete, living. It is all replete, packed with consciousness. It is the supreme knowledge above all human philosophies and religions. It is the spiritual path. It is yoga, tapasya, sadhana, everything in its single body. Savitri has an extraordinary power. It gives out vibrations for him who can receive them. The true vibrations of each stage of consciousness. It is incomparable. It is the truth in its plenitude. The truth Sri Aurobindo brought down on earth. So I would like to conclude this set of 4 talks by once again referring to the lines from the invocation to the Divine Mother, which also I think are an appropriate description of this great epic, Savitri. She is the golden bridge, the wonderful fire, the luminous heart of the unknown is she, a power of silence in the depths of God. She is the force, the inevitable word, the magnet of our difficult ascent, the sun from which we kindle all our suns, the light that leans from the unrealized vasts, the joy that beckons from the impossible, the might of all that never yet came down.